Hi, everybody. My name is Larry Hatteberg, and other than Marilyn, I may... Other than Marilyn, I may be the one who has known Darrell perhaps the longest. I was there when he got his first job. I was the guy that gave him his first job. And Darrell was in college in Wichita. This was in the 60s. And one of our other photographers, a man by the name of Ron Lowen, that many of you probably know, was in class with this guy who had just gotten out of the Marines and a little rough around the edges, but we had an opening, and he brought Darrell in one day. And Darrell came in, and when you looked into Darrell's eyes, you knew that he had done things and seen things that the rest of us had not seen. So I gave him a camera, much like this one that Ron Turner had up, Bell & Howell 70DR, 3 lenses. I said, okay, here's your tryout. Go out and shoot something. To this very day, Darrell Barton is the only photographer, the only photojournalist that when you put a camera in his hand, it was magic. He didn't need a lot of schooling. It was an extension of his brain to have this camera in his hand. And when he went out and when he filmed in those days, what he brought back was as beautiful as melting butter. It was just gorgeous stuff. He could just shoot. He could just tell a story so easily, and it ticked me off. Because, you know, the rest of us make all these mistakes, and Darrell did make mistakes, there's no question about that. But Darrell had this unique ability to just put the camera in his hand and simply tell a story, and I was so jealous of that, and he could just do it. Well, back in the 60s, in our shop, you had to wear a coat and tie. I know why you're laughing. Darrell wore the coat and tie, and he tried so hard to be part of the corporate world. He really did. He tried very hard. And there was this one time in which my wife, my lovely wife over here, was about to give birth to our child, our first child. And at the same time, this wonderful trip to Germany came up to cover some Army movements that were happening over there from Fort Riley in Kansas, and I was scheduled to go. But Judy decided to give birth about that same time, so Darrell was the one who got to go on this wonderful, wonderful trip, and I hated that too. So our management gives Darrell, now imagine this, 3 weeks in Germany. Our management gives Darrell $200 and a credit card in someone else's name. And I said, shouldn't we give him more money? That's 3 weeks in Germany. And my boss said, we're not sending him over there to have a good time. $200 for 3 weeks in Germany? Well, Darrell left. And we didn't hear a thing from him for 3 weeks. My boss was going nuts. We heard not a word. Then all of a sudden, via air transport, we got his film in from this exercise that he was doing. And I was the one who had to edit it. And it was absolutely gorgeous. It edited together so easily and so beautifully and told such a great story of what these people were going through on their maneuvers over there. I hardly had to do anything with it. He was just that kind of guy, but my boss did not like that. And Darrell worked for us for 3 or 4 years. And during that time, the tie kind of went away, as you might imagine. And the boss would occasionally challenge Darrell, and that didn't go over well. As you well know, you don't challenge Darrell. Well, after a period of time, my boss came to me and said, it's time for him to move on. So I am the only guy in the world who has ever fired Darrell Barton. And I did. And I think at that point, our friendship really got strong. I'm looking at that picture up there. When I fired him, that's pretty much the look right there that I got. Working in television in the 1960s with someone like Darrell Barton, and in that incredibly creative time, we competed against each other, and it was so exciting because we were both like sponges, and Darrell would do this incredible shot, and I'd look at it, and I'd copy it in one of the next stories I did, and maybe I'd do something, and he'd copy it. We were really in a time when creativity and television was being designed, and it was so exciting. And it was so exciting to be there with Darrell because he challenged me. He challenged me to be better, and I think I challenged him to be better. And we worked. We had that synergy between each other, and we worked together and learned from each other, and it was an exciting and it's a great time. And when he left, I think our friendship really solidified. And over the course of time, I think that I may be responsible for Darrell's career. Had he stayed in Wichita, it would have never happened. But fortunately, we all know what Darrell became. Now, Darrell was many things, and he was a great teacher on many levels. Obviously, he taught at the workshop, and he loved to teach at the workshop. And anybody who came up, and of course, they had a chair when somebody was about to be critiqued. And if you were to be critiqued by Darrell, then they'd put the chair up in front of everybody, and Darrell would come and stand in front of you. And it was the worst feeling in the world. Now, at the workshop, I was there when Darrell first went through as a student. And it didn't go well because Darrell, as you know, liked to challenge the people at the workshop, and it didn't go well. There was a gentleman there by the name of R.P. Smith, and R.P. just tore into Darrell all the time. He was on the faculty, and Darrell gave it right back. And I thought, this is not going to go well for Darrell. But you know Darrell. He has a way of working himself into your heart. And over the course of time, he and R.P. became fast friends. And I think Darrell may be the only guy who was ever arrested at the workshop. Marilyn's shaking her head, yeah? Believe me. Yeah, Darrell was arrested on assignment at the workshop, which surprised no one. But Darrell enjoyed the workshop, and he enjoyed getting in people's face because he made them think. And you know what? The students who go to that workshop, they dreaded it, but they loved it. And if you were critiqued by Darrell, you wore a badge of honor because you made it through that critique. And Darrell could look at you as you're sitting in that chair and your work is showing up on this screen, and he could look at you. And boy, that was a terrible feeling. And if you tried to argue with him, if you tried to challenge him, no one challenged Darrell Barton because he gave it right back. And to be critiqued by him, as I say, was a wonderful, wonderful thing. And it was a badge of honor. And people would go to the workshop hating it and loving it at the same time. Darrell, despite his rough exterior, though, he had a heart of gold. Later in his career, and I knew that over the course of time because Darrell and I became very close friends. And you saw these little moments with Darrell in which the tough exterior would fade away. One of his great friends of all time was Bob Brandon. And they were really brothers from different families. And he and Bob worked at 60 Minutes and 48 Hours, and they spent days and weeks and months together. And they really did respect each other. They really loved each other. And later in his life, Bob Brandon became ill, and Darrell Barton was always there for Bob. If Darrell Barton was your friend, he was your friend for life. He was your friend forever. And he and Bob were incredibly close over that time. And as a teacher about life, he was not only a teacher about photography, but he was a teacher about life. And as a teacher about life, he showed the rest of us how to live. And he showed us what being a friend was all about. And he was a friend to Bob Brandon. There was no question about that. Darrell is one of those figures that you don't forget. He would come up and visit me in Wichita. We would never go to a fancy restaurant. We would go to the little Beacon restaurant. And for those of you who are not familiar with that, it's just a little hole-in-the-wall cafe next to the Wichita Eagle. And he loved that place. You know, it had a waitress named Flo. And he loved going in there because he was really a man of the people. And he enjoyed that place. And we would talk about lots of things, and he would talk about his family. And he would tell me about Carrie and Jack and what they're doing, and he was so excited to tell me. But when he would talk about them, and when he would talk about Marilyn, everything would change. That tough exterior just all melted away, and he got quiet and introspective and retrospective, talking about Carrie and Jack and Marilyn. And he loved them dearly. And he was not the man that you see. He was so much more. And I know, and I found it humorous what you said, sister, about when he was told to get to the back of the line. You know, that happened to Darrell a lot, because it did. It did. When he would walk into a restaurant or walk into a place, people would do a double take because he looked tough. You know, you had to really wonder who this guy is that walked in. But for all the people who worked with him, all his friends who were sound people and producers, they knew what he was. They knew who he was. And I always get a kick. One story Darrell loved to tell was a story, and I don't know whether this was with 60 Minutes or 48 Hours, but he told the story about this young producer who was assigned to him. And they were doing this very difficult story in a very hairy, difficult part of town. And this young producer walked up to Darrell and said, "Mr. Barton, don't worry, everything's going to be okay because I brought my journalism book with me." And always refer to the journalism book. Darrell loved that little story. But Darrell was one of those people, one of the most unforgettable people that I ever met and that I ever had the pleasure of working with. About 3 or 4 weeks before Darrell went into the coma, I wrote him a letter because I wanted to tell him he was right about something. Over the course of time, your views of life change. I know mine certainly does. And years ago, decades ago, there was a guy, a photojournalist, who I didn't like. I didn't like him much at all. You don't know him, you've never heard of him, and he's been dead for years. But Darrell did. And Darrell saw something in this guy that I didn't see. And for years, I wondered what he saw in this guy. And over the course of time, my life changes, everybody's life changes. I started to see what Darrell was talking about. I got into the television business because people said I was a people person. Darrell Barton was much more of a people person than I was. And when he saw this guy who I didn't like and who I thought was probably a detriment to our business, he saw something else. He saw a guy with a heart that was crying out. He saw a guy who needed a friend, and Darrell was his friend. And it took me a long time to figure that out. And I wanted to tell Darrell about that. So over the course of time, I wrote this letter, and it just happened to be 3 or 4 weeks before he went into that coma. And I was so glad I did. And I wanted to get it off my chest and, come to terms with that. And Darrell sent me the most wonderful picture, and I'm glad the sister is here. And it was a tight shot, a still picture, an 11 by 14, of two nuns holding hands. And he sent it to me, and he just signed at the bottom, Darrell. Now, to me, the picture is a metaphor. It is not a picture of two nuns holding hands. It's a picture of our friendship over the course of time. And it was just one of those unusual things that this occurred in the few weeks before Darrell went into the coma. And I treasure that picture because it's a symbol of decades of our time together. And we had a great time together. I am the lucky guy because I got to work with this man who became a legend in the business, and this man who became a legend in all of our hearts. A great, great human being. Thank you.